I'm happy to announce the second webinar hosted by Maersk concerning refrigerated cargo. The webinar is delivered by Ms. Anne-Sophie Zerlang Karlsen, Global Head of Reefer Solutions for Maersk. She brings with her over 15 years of industry experience, spanning over 4 countries. The webinar today will deal with refrigerated logistics or cold chain logistics, especially in terms of the approach and preparation on the basis of your commodity to ensure effectiveness of the supply chain and reduce risks. Thank you all for joining us today. We hope that this can benefit all of our exporters out there. If you have any questions, please do use our chat box and we will come back to it at the end. Before I give the mic to Miss Anne, I'd just like to say that who will be moderating the session is Nina Jason, and she will be moderating the session today. Thank you so much. Anne, over to you and welcome. Hi, Anne, can you hear us? Hi, Anne.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Perfect. Yes, I can hear you.
Excellent.
Thank you so
Will
much.
you
Can
will
you?
you also hand over the control of the slide deck, please?
Yes, give me 1 second, and there you go.
Excellent. Then we are ready to begin. Welcome, everyone, and thank you very much for that introduction. I have been looking very much forward to today. As said, my name is Anne-Sophie Zerlang Karlsen, and I'm the lucky girl who is the head of what's called Global Reefer Solutions for Maersk. Maybe I should just start with demystifying the word reefer. Reefers is slang in the logistics industry for a refrigerated container, which is, you can easily see them because it's always the white ones, no matter which brand they are going under. I'm extremely passionate about the reefer industry and the reefer business, and that's for several reasons. Number one, I truly love it because it's highly complex. The refrigerated industry is 90% of everything that moves is food, and that means that it is perishable and can actually completely decay during transportation, which means that us in the logistics industry have an even bigger job to do and have higher, you can say, demands to doing a good job transporting goods from A to B or from farm to supermarket. Secondly, then I'm very proud of working in the reefer industry simply because, as said before, it's 90% food, and as such, it's all about feeding the world, putting food on people's tables. So I'm very happy to get the time today to talk about this subject. I normally say that any day I get to talk about reefer and the refrigerated shipping industry is a good day. Today, I am going to take us through 4 main things. I've been thinking about what I wanted to talk about, and because it's a very vast, a wide subject, and as such, I could talk about it for hours. But for the next 30 minutes, I'm going to take you through the 4 main things that I think I would consider myself if I was to start venturing into reefer transportation or cold chain logistics. The 4 headlines are as follows. Number one, it's all about understanding your commodity. We're going to talk a little bit about what that means, but because the cargo is perishable during transportation, and because no two commodities in reality are the same, then this is where everything starts, and absolutely the most important point I'm going to make today. Number two is some of the considerations about how and with whom you should contract when you start doing cold chain logistics. That's all about how much of the risk you want to take on your own. It is about what kind of mode of transportation you need. And it's very closely linked again back to understanding your commodity. Source number three, This is about the transparency. In almost all perishable transportation or reefer transportation, there is a high need for transparency through the supply chain. And the reason for this is that very often the customers that you need to sell your products to, they will require to see that the cargo has actually been carried within the standards or within the temperatures promised from A to B. So we're going to talk a little bit about the needs and also what options there are in the market for providing that. And lastly, a short overview of how you can limit your risk, simply because the risk in the cold chain logistics is higher than it is in normal logistics. But with that being said, then let's start talking a little bit about knowing your commodity. So I would say there's four main things to begin with that you should consider about when you venture into to cold chain logistics. In about your knowing what your product is. Number one is you need to have a very good understanding of what the shelf life of your cargo is. Because if your cargo can last only for a few weeks after harvest, for instance, then maybe or most likely the most important thing for your cold chain or for your logistics is actually speed. But it could also be that the product you are dealing with actually has a pretty long shelf life, and that then means that you can choose a more slow mode of transportation, but also a cheaper mode of transportation. So it's extremely important that you in detail know how long your produce can survive from it's being harvested until you want to sell it to a consumer. And likewise, understanding the value of your cargo, how relevant is actually the logistics cost in your total cost of goods sold. For some produce, it is very low. It's only about 1% of it. For instance, if you're shipping on the front page, we had blueberries. Blueberries is a very high value commodity, where in reality, the cost of the logistics is not that relevant. It can be as low as 3 to 5%. But if you're transporting something like bananas, well, then it can be as high as 25 to 30% of your total cost of goods sold. So this is a trade-off that you should always keep in mind. In very broad terms, we normally say that for very high value cargo with very short shelf life, normally we see that being transported by air. And when we move up with longer shelf lives and maybe lower value, then the next step is road and rail. And lastly, we have ocean. It is not by coincidence that you here see the ocean box being the biggest, because as you will see shortly, that is by far where most of the refrigerated cargo is transported today. The next thing you should think about when you venture into cold chain logistics is actually your quantity. Do you have enough quantity to actually fill a 40-foot reefer container? Yes or no? And if you do not, what do you then need to do? If you have enough to fill one container on your own, it's not really a problem. Then you can go and hit a contract and order a container. We'll get into through whom. But if you do not, then it's very important to think about how you actually take cold storage into the mix. A cold storage facility is a warehouse that is refrigerated, and very often for small produce or smaller exporters, it can make sense to as such build.
Webinar.
Guys, can I get you to mute your lines? Thank you very much. Yeah, so the question around whether you need cold storage in your supply chain to actually build to stock and be able to put produce in to the cold store until you have enough to fill a full container. And that, of course, again, have a massive impact on how fast you can move your produce through your supply chain. So firstly, understand your shelf life, understand the value, and and your quantity. Do you have enough to fill a container? Yes or no? Lastly, it's important to understand the special, or whether there are any special customs rule for your commodity. If you, this can be a various of things according to what you want to ship. If you are in the pharma industry, then the requirements for customs in most countries. The list is very long for what the rules are you have to live up to. This comes to how precise you need to be on temperatures in your cold chain. If you transport something like citrus, then most likely you will need to do a cold treatment of the cargo to make sure that you don't bring in bugs and diseases into at least a long list of Western countries, and so on and so on. It's extremely important to understand this up front, because that can again have massive consequences for the steps you need to take even before starting to export. So again, it's back to not only knowing your own commodity, but also knowing the rules, the customs rules around it. And when you know all of this, then maybe it's also worth asking yourself how much effort and time you are willing to yourself to spend on logistics. Now, these overall points is as such only the beginning. In this WebEx here, we're going to spend most time talking about the ocean piece of the cold chain. And the reason for that is not only that I work for a company that mostly is a shipping company, but it's actually more because by far most of the world produce, as I said before, moves on a ship. And that is because by far most of the global different kinds of commodities that's being traded globally, they actually have a shelf life that's long enough to survive in a container on board a vessel. So this will be the main focus of it today. But if you later have questions that goes from either before the ship or after the ship, so to say, in the supply chain, I will do my very best to answer those as well. So those are the first things you need to understand about your commodity. The next thing is then to understand what kind of commodity and what temperature settings you need to choose. Temperature settings in refrigerated transportation is obviously alpha or omega. Basically, we in the logistics industry normally separate the different types of commodities into two overarching groups. They're called something as simple as frozen or chilled. And I just want to spend a little time explaining to you guys what the key differences are between the two. Now, frozen commodities is what we in logistics call the easier commodities. And normally it is it's products like fish or other kinds of protein, beef, pork, chicken, and so on that are transported in frozen environments. When we look at a refrigerated container, then that can carry cargo that is frozen from either from -1 degree or all the way down to -60 degrees. And this can vary greatly what your need is according to what your commodity is. If you transport a lot of beef, for instance, then that will be transported around -1 to -3 degrees, while some fish actually has to be frozen as way down to -60 degrees. I say -60 because that is actually the limit as to what the current technology in the refrigerated containers can do. They're called super freezers, and it's a special kind of reefer equipment that you might need, maybe especially if you're transporting something like salmon or tuna. When you're shipping frozen commodities, then the temperature variance through the supply chain can be okay if it's only between 1 to 3 degrees or so. The reason as such is quite logic. It's a little bit the same as if you have something that's lying in your freezer. Well, then if the freezer does not work for 15 minutes or so, and the temperature variance is a little bit, well, the produce will stay frozen for that time. While if it is in a refrigerator, the commodities are often a lot more sensitive, and we will get back to that. But that means that the how sensitive, as said, how sensitive or sensitive the requirements are to how stable a temperature you have in the refrigerated container from A to B is between those 1 to 3 degrees as a general rule of thumb. There's also something around the storage capabilities of your frozen produce. Normally we say that you can store the frozen produce between 6 to 12 months. You can store them in what we talked about before, the cold store facilities, or it can also be in the refrigerated containers, simply meaning that very often you will be able to have a much longer transit time or a much longer lead time from A to B when you're doing frozen transportation. So on the frozen commodities, when you venture into cold chain logistics, I would say that the two main things you should remember are, number one, what kind of equipment do you need? Well, here I would say for 90% of all produce, you would most likely just need a regular reefer container. They are vastly available in the world. And only if you transport commodities that needs to be frozen down below -30, so from -30 to -60 degrees, will you need what is referred to as a super freezer. And those can be less readily available in the market. So this is when we get back to whom to contract with later, this might be something to consider. So the frozen commodities is the easier commodities. So let's move on to the more difficult ones. We call it chilled commodities, and the reason for that is simply that it is transported from temperatures between 1 to 15 degrees as such. Here, the temperature variances are very problematic for by far most producers. But if you transport melons or citrus or bananas or pharma, well, then the variances that the commodities can endure are extremely different. On most commodities, however, a variance of just half a degree for just 5 or 6 hours can actually have massive impact on the quality of the cargo when it arrives at destination. Here, you also have a larger choice on when it comes to equipment types. And I would also say that equipment types are much more impactful, because a standard reefer unit can easily transport a lot of the chilled cargo between 1 to 15 degrees. But here we also have something that's called controlled atmosphere units. Controlled atmosphere units is a refrigerated container where you don't only change the temperature during transportation, but you also change humidity as well as O2 levels in the container. The O2 levels you change because you basically try to change the ripening patterns of the especially fruit during transportation. And if you're talking about something like bananas or avocados or even berries, well, then you can actually extend the shelf life of the produce through using these O2 regulated units by up to 40 to 50%. So that means that controlled atmosphere units in reality can open a completely new market for you. If you are sitting in Latin America, for instance, and you want to export bananas, well then without controlled atmosphere, maybe you can only reach destinations like North Europe, while with controlled atmosphere, you can easily go both to China or to the Middle East. So this is a very big consideration to do. Control atmosphere units are, I have to say, more expensive than a regular unit, but especially for these commodities, also very much worth it. Shelf life of chilled commodities is obviously a lot shorter. And again, it's difficult to set a normal rule, but we do see, as I said before, in the berry example, a lot of berries have extremely short shelf lives. And that means that storage is something that is highly unfortunate in a cold chain, in an end-to-end cold chain, simply because you are reducing the value of the cargo each day. If we know this, then let's talk a little bit about the different types of options you have for the contracting. I'm going to start with an option that is speaking to a freight forwarder. A freight forwarder is a company, we often call them just forwarder. It's a company that arranges your import and exports of any good. A forwarder is simply a company that takes over all the hassle of your logistics. They can help you with doing everything from the preparation of your shipping and export documents. They can give you advice on cargo care, meaning what equipment to use, what temperature setting to use, and so on. They can help you out with whether there's room in your cold chain, room in terms of time to do cold storage, and whether it is efficient if you need, or whether you need to build to stock to have enough cargo for a full container, yes or no. They can also help you with book space for your cargo on a ship, on an airplane, on a truck, on a rail, whatever it is you need. A lot of forwarders, they are very big in the refrigerated industry. And when we're talking about whether to use forwarders, yes or no, then I would say that it can very often be a good solution. But if you ask me personally what my advice to you would be, it is to always pick a specialized reefer forwarder. And that means that if you are venturing out to exporting citrus or bananas or pharma or whatever it might be, find a forwarder who really, really knows something about that commodity. If you're gonna, you can say, outsource the logistics, then it's very important that it's to someone who knows even more, or at least just as much as you, about the specific commodity. Because in reality, the risk of doing something else and something going wrong in the cold chain is simply, in my mind, too great. So that's at least what I would do. Alternatively, I would say that any global ocean carrier today, whether it's Maersk, MSC, CMA, ONE, and so on, they are extremely equipped and able to do refrigerated transportation. So you can also contact either of these big lines, who will both have the specialized equipment that you need, and also, I would say, a large knowledge and expertise down to a commodity level. But it is clear that if you're contracting directly with a shipping line, you will also have to manage the different handovers in the process more than if you do so with a forwarder. We will speak more about later how Maersk can try to help you with this, and how the entire industry is moving on this subject. But I would say the big trade-offs here is simply the amount of time and the amount of responsibility you want to take for the logistics of your business. Transparency. One of the things with forwarders is that forwarders in reality becomes, you can say, a middleman between you and the final customers, as well as the suppliers in the logistics industry. This is not at all necessarily a bad thing, but one of the things that I would always ask you to think about is to make sure that you have transparency in terms of the cold chain, simply in terms of the temperature that your cargo has been transported under from A to B. The reason this is important is back to the risk. Because if you are standing in a situation where your customer opens the container and sees that there is a problem with the produce, it's very important for you to be able to have data, evidence, you can say, to have a data-driven conversation with your customer about the conditions under which your cargo has been transported. There are several ways, I would say, to handle this. The most common way in cold chain logistics today is what we call temp-tails. It's simply a small unit that you add into the container in your cargo during transportation. You simply add this before you close the doors to the container in the farm, and then your customer will be able to collect it on the other side when the container is opened again. A temp-tail will be able to basically show the temperature of all times during transportation. It's important to say here that these temp-tails are, unfortunately, you can say, it is not very proactive, because you will only be able to really read what has happened after you are opening the doors, and that means you will only be able to start tackling the problem after the fact. We are right now seeing a logistics industry that is fighting very hard to enter the digital ages, I would say. So there's a new competitive arena in logistics, and that is for sure transparency, and for sure real-time transparency. Telematics and the Internet of Things is really going to be a big deal, or a big mover for this in the industry. Last year in Maersk, we launched our new remote container management, which as such is an Internet of Things setup where we have installed chips in our containers and antennas on our vessels that are hooked up to satellites, and that means that you can in real time at any time read the temperature in your container, the atmosphere in your container. That comes down or back to the O2 levels and the humidities that we talked about before. You can see the location of your container, and you can also see if the container has been on power or have had off power in the supply chain. Why is this important? Well, the reason this is important is that this changes from having to explain to your customer why something went wrong after the fact, to instead being able to know exactly when something goes wrong and being able to advise your customers if something is not according to plan, and enable you to be able to make better plan Bs, you can say. On top of that, you will also be able to use this data to have better conversations with your logistics provider. Whether it's a forwarder or directly with the shipping line, you will now be able to sit down and actually look at where the root causes for potential failures in your cold chain are arising. So telematics is coming to the cold chain industry. It's something that I think you should think about. Ask your logistics provider about how you get the best transparency. And I would actually, if it was me, I would demand it. The risk without it is simply too high. Now we talk about risk. So let's just, to summarize, talk a little bit about how you do limit your risk. Well, number one, we talked about knowing your commodity, right? Know what the shelf life is, know what your value is. Use that knowledge to have an opinion about what mode of transportation you are going to be using. Use that knowledge to know what type of container is actually going to optimize your cold chain. Ask for transparency. Make sure you have it. And if you're using Temptails, that is totally okay. But make sure that your customer also understand what level of transparency there is in the cold chain. Always deal with specialists. At least if it was me, and I know that all of you would know everything there is to know about your commodity, I would require that my partner in the cold chain would know exactly just as much, even more preferably, and be able to give me advice. Give me advice on all of these things, from mode of transportation to type of container to how to get the best transparency, but also on things that we haven't touched upon in details here, like Incoterms. When is who responsible for what in terms of the cargo and the supply chain? When do you have to take responsibility, and when does the responsibility actually shift to your customers or middlemen on the other side of well, in ocean shipping, the water? Lastly, I think it's extremely important to always consider whether it's worth it to have an insurance. For most of the refrigerated containers, we see that our customers do invest in insurance. It can be cargo insurance, meaning that if something goes wrong, an insurance company will actually take the full responsibility for the full value of your cargo. And it can also be something like freight insurance, so they will cover not only the value of your cargo, but also all of the money that you have spent on the transportation. I think insurance is an extremely important element here. It is something that you can contract on your own. It is something that you can contract through a freight forwarder. And it is also something that we see more and more of the shipping companies being able to offer you together with your overall supply chain solutions. So insurance, I would say often it is something like around 1 to 2% of your cargo value that it will cost you. And if you think about the overall risk you have if something goes wrong, and the fact that the entire cargo lot that you have in container actually can decay, I would heavily recommend that you always take on that. More information. We will share this presentation afterwards. Here's a link to some general information on refrigerated transportation. It's an industry newsletter that goes through a lot of similar, I would say, considerations to this, but has a lot more detail on the different kinds of equipment and temperature settings. There's also a link to the Incoterms, as talked about before. What does that actually mean? Why are you responsible from A to B? And lastly, we put in an overview of the Maersk Reefer Solutions and what we in Maersk can actually help you out with. As I said earlier, then Maersk are, as other shipping lines as well, venturing into wanting to become our customers' logistics partner, not only for ocean, but actually from what we call farm to supermarket. And that means that if you contact us today, we will be able to, of course, help you out on ocean transport through, it could be Maersk, Hamburg Süd, or Safmarine, which is our global ocean brands, or regionally through Sealand, a Maersk company. That's for the ocean part. But today, if you speak to anyone in a Maersk office, they will also be able to help you out with logistics and services. So everything from inland services to value adds, as that could be something like custom house brokerage, or helping you out with your transparency requirements in terms of our remote container management. And within this year, we will also be able to offer you cold storage in quite a long list of locations. So we are here to help you in any way if ever needed. And with that, those were the words from my side, and I'm hoping that if you have questions, I will do my very best to answer.
Hi everyone, this is Nina Jessen from ITC SheTrades. Thank you so much, Anne-Sophie, for your presentation. It was extremely interesting. I'm sure all of the participants will take away some extremely valuable knowledge and be able to apply it to their personal enterprise and their exports. If you would be so kind as to pass me back the little icon next to your name so that I can conduct the questions.
Yes, just a second.
Thank you, and I hope everyone can hear me. If not, please do let me know in the questions box below, in the chat box, sorry. Perfect, thank you. So please everyone, if you have any questions, excuse me, if you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat box now and I'll read them out so Anne-Sophie can answer them. There were a few questions that came in during the presentation as well. Number one, if cargo gets lost during its journey, which measures are then taken?
That's a very good question. So I would say that any logistics company who operates in cold chain logistics will go very, very far to minimize, I would say, cargo loss when it comes to reefer containers. So that means anything from delays to temperature variances. And it actually comes back to both the risk that we've talked about as well as the Incoterms and the liability. Because because the commercial value of the cargo is often quite high, at least in comparison to a lot of the other things that we are transporting in normally non-refrigerated containers, then for a shipping line, for instance, the risk is also quite big. So I would say if you look at our performance on making sure that we get reefers to the right place at the right time is significantly higher, simply because of that. Risk is always a prioritization for us, and also even more because the commodities are perishables. We know that for our customers, business is extremely hurtful if we see full decay of cargo. I would say in terms of losses of cargo, sometimes it does happen. I can tell you that up to it's around 1.3 to 1.4% of all reefer containers, they actually do have a temperature failure during transportation. but it's only half of that where it has an impact. When it does have an impact, then the way it normally works is that you go through a claim process. And I would say that more and more logistics providers, I would say, are getting easier to deal with in terms of this, actually taking responsibility when we have been at fault in terms of damaging cargo. So if something does go wrong, there is claim processes. If you deal with a shipping line, you would go directly to them. If you deal with a freight forwarder, there will be a claims process with them, which they will then take further to logistics companies in the other end. I
Okay,
hope that
perfect.
answered the question.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it does. Sorry, I forgot to mention this. This was Ashwini Sadnor who asked this question. So Ashwini, I hope that covers your question. The next one I can see here from Surbi Agarwal. What are the insurances that should be taken? Marine, fire, drown, and sorry, I'm trying to understand the question. What are the insurances that should be taken for I guess for emergencies on during cargo, during shipping, if I'm understanding this question correctly?
Yes. So, I mean, there's different kinds of insurance. I think it's a quite a wide that wide number of different products. But you can either what we see normally is a lot of customers are taking they have a cargo loss, you can say, insurance, meaning if there's damage to the cargo, then they get that covered by an insurance. But it's true that there's also insurances out there which is not only cargo loss, but it's actually also on the transportation cost. Without going into immense detail here, then bill of lading, which is the contract as such, or you have with a shipping company, for instance, if you do ocean transportation, you are covered by something called the Hague-Visby rules. And I also saw that there was someone asking about that. Under the Hague-Visby rules, you can actually have a quite significant exposure if there is a fire on a vessel or a vessel sinks. I mean, luckily that is extremely rare that these cases happen, but there you can, as a customer, actually have quite large exposure to risk, and you can also take an insurance against that. So that's that. I would say it's two different products. You can either insure your cargo, so the loss of the commercial cargo, and you can also insure yourself towards the liabilities that you have in logistics, especially on ocean transportation. So I think it's worth considering, which of the two, or maybe both, that you would consider when you venture into cold chain logistics.
Okay, thank you, Anne-Sophie. The next question I have here from Lydia, I think she's wondering, she says she's going into shea butter processing, transporting from northern Uganda to Germany, and she's asking whether you have any knowledge on shea butter by sea, or perhaps the question also implies what is the best way to transport shea butter?
To my knowledge, I actually believe that we can do that in a refrigerated container by ocean. So I believe we have a contact point set up afterwards that we will also be sharing. So I would love to help out with more specifics on that afterwards, just because I think it's probably a longer conversation than what I can cover here. But I would be very happy to. So when we share the presentation, we'll also share a contact, and then we will come back with more details.
Thank you. Next question from Philip. CO2 levels in the reefer, can they be to which extent can these be controlled? How can it be monitored remotely?
Yes, so if you are using what's called a control atmosphere container, then you can adjust the O2 levels. And basically, what you're doing is that you're pulling out the oxygen of the container to slow down ripening of fruit. It can be monitored remotely. Both of these, we talked about the temp tails, they can often measure it after the fact. Or if you are shipping in a Maersk refrigerated unit, then you will be able to use remote container management where you can also monitor it. So it can definitely be monitored through you can say both methods. Does that answer the question? I'm not sure whether I lost you. Can you still hear me?
We can hear you.
You can hear me. Ah, that's good.
Sorry, hi everyone. Sorry, I was muted for a second. Yes,
No
thank
problem.
you for the answer. That was a question from Philip, and Philip says thank you, Anne. So I guess that answers his question fully. Thank you very much. Next question from Fatima Zara El Harati. Does value protect enough, or do we need to get insurance as well to cover the cargo loss?
So Value Protect is a Maersk offering to the market. It's actually not correct to say that it is an insurance product. To be honest with you, what Value Protect is a decrease of liability, I would say, product. So basically, what you're buying is that these famous Hague-Visby rules that I talked about before. I'm sorry to be getting extremely shipping technical here, but it's basically a waiver of these. So also, if Fatima would be very happy to share more information on Value Protect and what it is and what it is not. But I would say offhand, if you're asking me whether I think Value Protect is enough to cover cargo loss, and in the sense we've been talking about insurance here, I have to say no. It is, however, a big dream, both of mine and of Maersk, to be able to very soon to offer you a real insurance product that would be able to cover this.
Okay, thank you, Fatima. I hope that at least provides some clarity and for further conversation about this. So if you have any more questions, please feel free to write them in the chat box. The next question I have: how do you know whether the freight forwarding person is qualified or not? There are experts and amateurs. I guess the question is how can you be sure of the qualification of the
You know
person
what?
you're dealing with?
That's an extremely good question. Because that's really difficult, right? How do you know whether someone is a true expert or not? I think I would try when you meet new suppliers, or you're picking out your suppliers on this. I would really speak to them about, how much experience do they have in shipping that specific commodity? Yeah, who are some of their other customers, and so you get a feel for whether some of your competitors or some of the other guys, that around you who are dealing in the same commodity, whether they are also using this. I think that is often a good indication. But it's really about not just picking up the phone and calling someone and say, would you please handle my logistics? When it comes to perishable goods, that is such a big part of your business and the whole business model, you can say, that it's important that you get to know them and really understand the expertise. So my advice here would be to take the time and spend the time with the supplier of your choice. Maybe speak to a few different ones to get a feeling of what their level of expertise really is. So, because it is true that is very difficult to just pick out of a number in a phone book. Spend the time to understand their experience level.
Thank you. That was a very good question, I think, for everyone. That was from Rose Glitzgarner. Thank you. Next question from Bridget Emo Kai. What is the best way to get in touch with someone locally in Nigeria for refrigerated transportation? I guess, yes, the question is sort of where to start. with your local area.
Yeah. So I would actually say a little bit the same. I mean, either ask around in the industry and other people you know that are maybe in the same line of business as you about how they do it, and otherwise, well, I mean, maybe I'm a little colored here, but I'm always, you know, the links that we're send out, there will also be contacts to Maersk, so we will be very happy to of course help in any way we can. Especially in Nigeria, we are very present and able to do refrigerated logistics. So we're very happy to do that. But I would say otherwise, talk around in the industry to figure out what is the most common used for the specific commodities. What do other people do, just to get a feeling of what is the most I would say common practice. And then I think if it was me starting, I would take guideline from that.
Thank you, Bridget. I hope that covers your question. If not, please feel free to write in the box. A lot of you are also asking whether you will be receiving a recording of this webinar and the presentation. Yes, you will. We will be sending that out shortly after we conclude the webinar. So the next question I have here, and also, sorry, I forgot to mention, we'll be sending out an evaluation form as well, of course. So you'll be getting a few things from us shortly. The next question I have for you, Anne-Sophie, are there linkages between of logistics services with the postal services? That is, could the cargo be shipped to the destination via first the postal companies and then exporters as the second step?
I'm sorry, could you say that again? Just broke up a little.
Sorry. Would there be linkages between logistics services with the postal services also? That is, could the cargo be shipped to the destination via first the postal companies and then exporters?
Okay, I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but basically, if the answer is whether you can both get someone to do the whole thing, to do it from farm to supermarket. That can either be a specialized forwarder. It could also be, you know, one of the global shipping companies who are venturing into doing, you can say, more than ocean and actually doing end-to-end solutions. So that's one solution. But you could also choose to either handle the ocean leg yourself and then have an exporter on the other side of the water who takes over there. And this is then where these Incoterms become important, you know. So until what point are you liable, and when does your importer at the other side actually take over the responsibility? So I would say there's a lot of different models on that. Very often, I would say the considerations I think I would make is very much also on your customer side. So where would your customer actually like to take receipt of your cargo? And are you able to get it all that way, or do you need a middleman in between? And I think that it comes very much back to how much time do you want to use or spend on your logistics. If you want to outsource it, then very often you will be able to find a freight forwarder or a global shipping line that would be able to do the whole thing. But it could also be that you want to contract individually, you know, first with a trucker, then with a shipping line, and maybe with an importing factor on the other side. So I would say it varies a lot. There's a lot of different options for it, and almost either model can be possible. So I'm sorry to not be able to give a super specific answer on that, but I think unfortunately the answer is it depends.
Thank you. That question was from Ashwini Satnor. Apologies if I didn't understand that question properly, but I hope that answers it. If not, please let us know. The next question we have is from Anastasia. What is the minimum quantity of commodity needed for an order to be justified?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. I think it depends a little bit again on the shelf life, right? I mean, if for instance you need to do air transportation, then you don't need a large quantity. If you're doing ocean shipping, well, then often I would say it is probably most affordable if you are able to ship a full container. But this thing with sharing containers, I can see here that there's another question. Maybe I can take that at the same time about putting multiple products into one container. And so I can tell you that it's not very common that we do that, and the reason for it is simply that because the products are alive while you're transporting them, then very often they will actually be impacting each other, or worst case, impacting each other contamination wise across. So even though you would be able to say that maybe 5 different kinds of citrus you should be able to put in one container and then it's not a problem. Well, yes and no. The problem is that if we do that and there's a bug from one of the 5 parties that we consolidate into one container, well then that contamination would spread across all of the cargo, and then who actually takes the liability and so on for that if something goes very wrong. So to be honest, today I think there are very, very few good solutions for ocean transportation if you are not able to fill a container. I do believe that this is something the entire industry is working hard on, because the day we can find out how to do this in a better way, it will obviously open up markets and enable global trade in terms of enabling smaller growers and exporters to be able to reach new markets. But today it's something that as an industry we are still really struggling with. Yeah.
Sorry,
I think okay.
I was. Hello, sorry, I was muted for a second.
Yes,
Thank
go
you
ahead.
very much for incorporating the answers into the rest of the questions into your answer. Because we only have about 2 minutes left, so I will just take the last question here, and that will be the last one for today's webinar. From Mario, what about, so drawing on the last question, sharing containers for non-perishable products, for example, furniture, textiles, clothing, baskets, etc.
Yes. So as I said before, then we're having problems as industry really dealing with this thing with sharing containers for the perishable industry or the refrigerated industry, while it's actually something that's much easier to do for non-perishables, because 3 different types of furniture won't really impact each other as long as you wrap it well enough while loading the container, then it should be okay. So it is definitely something that's possible in a non-perishable world, while in the perishable world we are still struggling as an industry to offer it.
Excellent, thank you very much. And I'm afraid that brings our webinar to a close today. Thank you everyone so much for participating, and thank you, Anne-Sophie, for an excellent presentation. It was extremely valuable, I'm sure, for many.
Good to hear. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And a bit of housekeeping just to finish. The next webinar will be on the 18th of June on the topic of what documentations do you need for customs and exporting. So we will be in touch regarding this next webinar shortly. And like I said, we'll be in touch with the recording and the evaluation form shortly as well. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a lovely afternoon.